Hello, I'm Rufus Glasper, a member of the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute Board of Directors. And on behalf of Justice O'Connor and the institute she founded, welcome to our Constitution series, Equality and Justice for All. We are honored to have as our inaugural guest speaker, Justin Hansford, a professor of law and the founder and executive director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center at Howard University School of Law. Dating back to 1869, Howard University School of Law is the nation's most renowned historically Black law school. The Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center is Howard's flagship institutional setting for the study and practice of civil rights, human rights, and racial justice advocacy. Hansford is a leading scholar and activist in the areas of critical race theory, human rights and law, and social movements. He is co-author of the forthcoming 7th edition of Race, Racism, and American Law, the celebrated legal textbook that was the first case book published specifically for teaching race-related law courses. He has a BA from Howard University and a JD from Georgetown University Law Center, where he was a founder of the Georgetown Journal of Law and Modern Critical Race Perspectives. He is a proud third-generation alumnus of Howard University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hansford today. For questions, please go to YouTube live chat and Facebook comment. Thank you. Here's Professor Hansford.
Good afternoon or good morning to people on the West Coast. My name is Justin Hansford, and I am the Executive Director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center at Howard University School of Law. And it is my distinct honor and pleasure to be speaking as the inaugural speaker of this important series at the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute. Thank you so much for the invitation to be involved in this program. I'm going to show you a PowerPoint presentation once I get it up and running that will help to illustrate some of the points that I'm going to make for you this morning. And it should be up shortly. So once again, thank you for your invitation today. I do believe that the screen should be showing you the PowerPoint presentation at this time. And I'm going to make a brief presentation followed by, I hope, a very robust session of questions and answers and engagement with you all. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this important subject. I wanted to give you a quick introduction to Howard University before I begin. I know some people may not be familiar with Howard. We are the leading university in the world serving African Americans in the African diaspora, one of the over 100 historically Black colleges and universities in this country that came out of the Reconstruction era move to educate those who were formerly enslaved. We are at the law school, the largest producer of Black lawyers in the country. And we are 5 times as large as the next largest historically Black college. We have many significant alumni, including Toni Morrison, Vernon Jordan, and of course, Justice Thurgood Marshall, after whom the Civil Rights Center is named. I wanted to talk about my story a bit this morning. It began with protests in Ferguson. Before I was at Howard University, I was a law professor at St. Louis University for 6 years. I lived about 10 minutes away from Ferguson when Mike Brown was killed, and I immediately began to be engaged in protests. I served as a legal observer in the protests. This is myself wearing the trademark neon green legal observer hat. For those who are not familiar with the program, The program is designed for people who are not seeking to be involved in protests necessarily every time they go out to engage in legal observing, but more so to observe and ensure that the rights of protesters are protected. And the neon green hat was supposed to keep me from being involved, and you can see how well that worked out for me. But I did protest. And in addition to that, one of the more important things I did as a person who was involved in the work in Ferguson was put together a human rights shadow report and represent Mike Brown's mother and the family of Mike Brown, and also the protesters in Ferguson as they went to Geneva, Switzerland, to argue before the United Nations that what had happened to Mike Brown and the question of police violence in the United States that takes place on a racial basis. This question is not just a civil rights issue, it's a human rights issue. It's not just an issue that affects people's citizenship rights, but it speaks to our very humanity, and it speaks to our very basic, essential human rights as people who deserve to be free from discrimination and who deserve to live in this society. This was perhaps the most important moment in my career. And if you think back to what was happening in Ferguson in 2014, as you know, there was no criminal trial for Darren Wilson. There was no civil trial. So for Mike Brown's mother, this was really the only opportunity that she had to allow her voice to be heard in a tribunal. In this case, the tribunal took place in front of people from all around the world. And she told me that this was very significant to her. And for me, the ability to help her to have her voice heard, to have her dignity recognized was so significant. It's a shame that we had to go all the way to Geneva, Switzerland to have her voice heard. But I was very proud to be part of that. And I can tell you at that time, there was nothing I wanted more fervently than the arrest and prosecution of Darren Wilson. And I want to stop here and make a quick comment about what is happening today, fast forwarding a little bit. We have heard many people discuss the question of defunding the police or abolishing the police. I myself have gone on a journey from wanting to see people who killed young Black folks like Darren Wilson under the guise of the law prosecuted and convicted, to having to really come to grips with this idea that maybe justice means something besides conviction. Maybe it means something besides hoping that helping Mike Brown's mother would best be accomplished through the criminal justice process. Maybe we need something else, like a fund for victims of police brutality, reparations. Maybe we need to do something besides think about retribution as our primary mode of justice. But I wanted to flag that for many of us who were activists in Ferguson, who are activists responding to the killing of Eric Garner or George Floyd or others, it's a very traumatic experience, and it's a very generous, very spiritual, very emotional process to try to move forward and think about other ways of obtaining justice for these families. We tried everything we could. We've gone to the courts, we've gone to the streets, we've gone to the United Nations, and we're looking for justice in any way, shape, or form that we can obtain that justice. But I wanted to note that as I moved forward to talk about the other experience I had that was formative for me, my participation as someone who provided in-person testimony before President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. During that experience, I had an opportunity to speak with people who were police chiefs from around the country. And of course, I realized that many of them were individuals, good people who were interested in seeing things get better in our society. But the problem was more the system than the individual. The problem was that many of these people did not recognize that we were not talking about bad apple police officers or the need to isolate individual bad actors and eliminate them from the system. Unfortunately, we have a system that continues on a consistent basis to make it impossible for people to hold those accountable who go to a place where they engage in brutality or who go to a place where they engage in racial discrimination, as demonstrated by the Ferguson report, which I recommend that everybody read, or as demonstrated by so many years of testimonies by members of the Black community. But this experience was very formative for me as well as the experience of becoming a professor of civil rights at St. Louis and later at Howard University School of Law. During that process, I studied something called critical race theory, which is a way of interpreting the law, which focuses on issues of racial inequality. And one of the core principles of critical race theory is this destruction of the myth of colorblindness. I wanted to mention this because I think that this audience would be particularly interested in the research which has shown that the ideal of reaching a society where color no longer plays any role in our day-to-day life is one that has done great damage to the cause of racial justice. And I say this because I think for many people, it's very difficult to allow the words Black Lives Matter to move past their lips because they believe that they should maintain the position that they do not see race. And I have found that in my experience, people who try to move through the world from the perspective of ignoring race also dangerously find themselves moving through the world from the perspective of not seeing racial inequality. If you don't see race, you won't see the stark racial inequalities in our society. And even more, dangerously, if you do see disparities in treatment in our society, those disparities may be individualized and found to be the fault of individual people based on their own behavior. Most disappointingly for many of us who are civil rights advocates, our own Martin Luther King Jr.'s words of his desire to see people based on the content of their character and not the color of their skin, that own phrase has been used to argue against efforts to end racial inequality and outcomes in our society, ranging from employment to education to policing. And we have found that those efforts to remedy past instances of discrimination have come up short when color has not been recognized. This is an idea, a myth that began with an opinion by Justice Harlan in the late 19th century in Plessy and has continued up through the jurisprudence of our Supreme Court unto today. However, if we are going to move forward as a society, I would like to posit that we have to begin to acknowledge the reality that colorblindness should not be our aspiration in our society. Instead, our aspiration should be to acknowledge people in the fullness of their identities and allow people to be proud of their identities and to treat people justly, not in spite of their identities, but perhaps because of their identities, taking into consideration their unique history, their unique experiences with the criminal justice system as a community, and their unique contributions that they can make to our society in the multicultural society that we hope to build for each other. Just another quick sidebar: as I came to Howard University Law School, I was very blessed to be part of the tradition here that is over 150 years old, and to step into the shoes of our great leader Thurgood Marshall and create something called the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center. We use our heads, our hands, and our hearts to do our work. What I mean by that is that we engage scholarship like critical race theory and use cutting edge ideas to understand, for example, that color blindness is not the answer. Then we get our hands dirty by litigating or working on policy matters using the law. But we also use our hearts to connect with our community and engage in community organizing as a organization. This has involved for us working on issues as diverse as reparations, police violence, and mass incarceration, litigating on behalf of folks who are at risk of COVID infection, and arguing for their compassionate release, filing lawsuits to have the curfews lifted in cities like Washington, D.C. and New York, and even going to the Inter-American Commission to argue for reparations and argue against police brutality, and working with local groups who are also seeking to have those goals realized. And we also support our students as they protest. But in closing, I want to come back to this idea of color blindness, because we believe that even today, as we face our crisis, and I know especially in Arizona, it's a rising crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, we must avoid the trap of color blindness once again. We have created a report called The Contradiction of Colorblind COVID-19 Response, and it describes how even today in 2020, we see COVID-related disparities in health, in the economic aspect of the relief. Black workers are much more likely to be laid off at this time when it comes to questions of domestic violence, when it comes to questions of incarceration, and of course, also when it comes to questions of policing. We have found Black Americans much more likely to be cited for violations of social distancing laws and other issues where the law is being applied in a way that is unjust. So there are many things that you can do to work to support organizations that are working not in a colorblind way, but in a way that is color conscious, seeking to provide answers to these problems. But most importantly, I want to end with a story that I think speaks to the crisis that we're facing and the stakes. When I was protesting in Baltimore in 2015, I had an opportunity to see a young boy that was about 10 years old in the protest. And he was at a mall where people were being shut in, and he was scared to death. But I had a chance to talk to him. I asked him where his family was. He didn't know. I talked to him for about 15 minutes. I asked him, well, what did he want to do when he grew up? When he grew up, he wanted to be a lawyer. I asked him, did he want to have a big family? He said yes. But I could see the fear in his eyes and the anger in his eyes as he looked at these police officers. And I walked away from that conversation with him once his family came and located him. I asked myself, what do we as a society owe that young child? What is going to happen to him when he becomes an adult? Will he be seen as a threat? Will he be seen as a criminal? There's a woman named Marian Wright Edelman who runs the Children's Defense Fund, who has moved throughout her amazing career based on the premise that we can judge a society, in her words, we can judge a society best by determining how that society treats its children. And here in this situation, when it comes to race in America and the criminal justice system, we are seeing people as children being trained to have aggression and distrust of the police, who are the stand-ins, who are the representatives of the state and the government in our society. And we are alienating another generation. So the crisis is so urgent, and the time to respond is now, and we cannot do so in a way that is colorblind, but we have to do so in a way that acknowledges that all Black lives matter. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to engage in a spirited discussion with you going forward. And I would love to answer all of your questions on any issue that you would like to raise.
Thank you very much, Professor Hansford. Let's start with this question. What can the average citizen do to help the country move forward the goal of true and equal justice for all?
So if you look at the last slide I put up, I mentioned a few things. I think that one thing that is easy to do would be to talk to your friends and family at your dinner table about these issues. Talk to your coworkers. Talk to people in your community about their experiences from the perspective of acknowledging that the problems are real, and the problems are not going to be solved by trying to ignore them or using the lens of colorblindness to do so. I think that too many people believe that there is a solution that can be created either through technology or small reforms in terms of policing. But what we've seen from our experiences over the last 6 years, as we continue to explore more and more interventions, is that none of them really worked. It's been 6 years since Ferguson, and we have not seen a drop in the number of people killed by police. We've actually seen a rise in that number. From Eric Garner now to George Floyd, it's like deja vu all over again. So we have to become much more willing to speak to people, build community, and of course, like I said, support Black-led organizations where you can do so. And I think that's those organizations on the ground that can help. You can, of course, always support our work at the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center. If you want to support Howard University or some of the smaller organizations, we're a 2-person shop here at the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center. I think I can put yes, our PowerPoint will be made available for those asking, and I think the host can put this link up under my picture if people want to donate to our center. But there are many places to donate, but I do think you should donate to organizations that are working on the issues that are most concerning to you, and organizations that are most importantly Black-led, because the problem is when other organizations argue that they can speak on behalf of the Black community, it's always a faulty assumption. And so so in addition to speaking to your family and friends, I do think that if you're going to take the approach of donating, I would say donate to Black-led organizations. And again, this is an uncomfortable conversation for people who have come from the context of feeling that race doesn't matter. But we have found that race does matter in the way that our society responds to our community members and to our chagrin. We are not yet at the point where race is not a factor in American society. I had such admiration for Justice O'Connor's opinion in the decisions around in Grutter and Gratz in 2003, arguing that we wanted to get to a place where affirmative action, for example, would no longer be necessary because race didn't matter in our society. And we're not there yet. We're not at the place where Justice O'Connor hoped we would be in 2020. And we should acknowledge that and try to get there as soon as possible, with the recognition that our goal isn't to make race no longer a entity in American society. Our goal is to make it no longer a barrier. It's not that we want to eliminate the distinctions on the basis of race from existing, because I'm proud of being Black. But the goal has to be to eliminate the fact that people are targeted on the grounds of their race by institutions like law enforcement.
So the next question is, a federal appellate court in DC ordered Judge Sullivan to dismiss charges against Michael Flynn. POTUS and AG Barr interfered along the way. Most POC wouldn't receive the same. What's next?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think that speaks to an issue that is relevant here, the issue of fundamental fairness. I think that it's important for us to understand that fairness means equal treatment under the law. And if we know that most people would not have gotten the treatment that Michael Flynn or some other associates of the president may have received in terms of their treatment on the basis of their relationships, and if that is the case, that is a fundamental betrayal of what our justice system should be all about. I'm thinking about Roger Stone as well. If those allegations are true, that is a fundamental betrayal of what our justice system is all about. And so, I'll be honest, as someone who myself believes adamantly in striving towards police and prison abolition, I think that my desire is not necessarily to create a world where every person who is in the criminal justice system gets the most punitive outcome possible. Again, it's the antithesis of that. I want to see us move to a place where we find other alternatives so that we can obtain justice without using incarceration. But I think that there has to be fairness, and if Flynn is going to be given this level of consideration, or Stone, then other people in the criminal justice system currently should be given the same level of consideration, people of color as well. So as opposed to leveling up, I'd rather level down if that is what we're going to do. But there has to be fairness. And if we don't have fairness, we're talking about a fundamental betrayal of our justice system. You can't even call it that if people are not getting fair sentences based on behaviors that they're engaged in that would have been more harshly penalized if they were people of color.
Do you think that social economic environment also plays a role in all of this?
So I believe that the social economic environments do play a role in all of this, very much so. Another core concept of the idea of critical race theory is the idea of unconscious racism and implicit bias. What that means is that most of us in American society are raised to have racial bias, particularly against Black people. Not necessarily does that mean our parents intended that to be the case. I'm not talking about intentionally, but in our culture, in the shows we watch, like Cops, where the police are always white and the bad guys are always Black, in the movies, in the music, the culture trains us to come to certain conclusions about people on the basis of race. So yes, our environment trains us to have bias, and it is deeply embedded in our unconscious. Unless you have done anti-racist work or reading or study, you probably have racial bias in your subconscious. There's another link I'm going to share something called the implicit association test that Harvard University created. It's based on some work by some social scientists there at Harvard, and people can take this test um, when they have an opportunity, and they can measure the level of implicit bias, and hopefully that will also show up on the screen shortly. That test will measure the implicit bias that might exist in your own subconscious. And again, this implicit bias towards Black people is not only something that is harbored by white people, it's harbored by Latinos, Asians, and Black people themselves. Black people themselves have implicit bias against other Black people. And that is instilled in us through our culture. So the short answer to your question is yes, there certainly is a socio-economic element to this. And that element is that everyone, police officers, judges, lawyers, doctors who have been shown to have bias when they respond to people in hospitals, less likely to give pain relief medication to Black people because there's a subconscious feeling that Black people don't experience pain as harshly. On an economic level, Black people less likely to receive credit to open businesses. The list goes on. Every aspect of society, education, in terms of the classroom, and who is assumed to know the answers and who's called on in class. And every element of our society has demonstrated through scholarly research that bias is affecting Black people, every aspect of our society. And that can only happen through the cultural transmission of implicit bias, which is a socioeconomic phenomenon.
Are you happy with the role and the work of the NDoubleACP over the last 105 years?
Well, the NDoubleACP was, that's an interesting question. The NDoubleACP was founded as an anti-lynching organization. At the beginning of the 20th century, W.B. Du Bois was involved in that. And unfortunately, here we are in 2020, we're still facing lynchings, which is what you have to call what happened to George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, and even Breonna Taylor and others. So if we can't measure the work of this organization based solely on the measurements around where we stand today on core issues like lynching. I think the NAACP was integral over the course of the 20th century in supporting the civil rights movement and many other initiatives. And it continues to develop and evolve unto today. And it continues to be one of the largest membership organizations for African-American people and Black people, not only in the country, around the world. So I do admire the NAACP for their legacy, for their contributions. I don't measure their work solely based on the results. If we had to look at the results, we're in a difficult place as Black people in 2020. We don't have segregation anymore, and that is so significant. And the NAACP played a major role in that being the case. But we have continued issues that they are continuing to work on, I'm sure. And yeah, I'm not going to pass judgment on their work based on the fact that we have faced crises today and we continue to face crises now. I think that they've been continuing to organize and they've been continuing to grow, and I'm happy that they exist.
So what can we learn from the example of Thurgood Marshall, who fought for expanded civil rights throughout his career, despite huge obstacles?
One thing that I would say about Thurgood Marshall, many people know him as the older gentleman in the black robe, the first African-American Supreme Court justice. But before that, he was known as Mr. Civil Rights. He was in the 1940s, a charismatic young lawyer who went into dangerous places in the South, representing Black men who were many times wrongfully accused of rape or murder, facing lynchings. And in some cases, people threatened to lynch him themselves, lynch Thurgood Marshall themselves when he went down to the South representing these people. He's someone who faced many challenges over his career and showed courage in his willingness to represent and fight for people, even when the rest of our society and our environment may have made it dangerous to do so. So for me, one of the things I take as an inspiration from Justice Marshall from his work as a young lawyer is this ideal of courage, the willingness to fight for on issues that may not necessarily be easy wins, to go to places, whether it's Ferguson, Missouri, or wherever, and be able to say that you are in the middle of really important struggles for people, and you did your best, and you did not let fear uh, determine how you would move in this world in your life. So I take the example from him to have courage in this advocacy, and to be clear, and Justice Marshall is someone who advocated in the courts. He was someone who was in the state house talking to legislators, trying to help move civil rights legislation. He was somebody who was in the streets supporting protesters. He went behind the bench to become a judge. He did not limit himself to one endeavor of pursuit. He used all avenues available to him for justice. And I know there may be many people here who are attorneys, who might be interested in doing civil rights work. But even if you're not an attorney, there are many different terrain, many different places where you can fight this battle, and don't feel like you're limited to one over the course of your career. Take an approach of thinking broad in terms of strategy and tactics, like Justice Thurgood Marshall did. And I think that will help us move forward in a much more efficient fashion.
So we have a women's book club. This is a group of white women in their 60s and 70s, and they would like for you to recommend some books, and we can provide the list later. They're trying to understand better too many of the issues. They need to understand them, and they need to have some resources to help them as they go on this journey. Can you just describe a few books at this time and possibly provide listings later?
Certainly, yeah. That's one thing I can do. I can do that for the rest of the presentation, but I'm going to try to keep this one short. I'm looking at my bookcase over here. Some of my favorite books, actually, Derek Bell has a number of good books. And We Are Not Saved is a great book by Professor Derek Bell, the first Black law professor tenured at Harvard University School of Law. I also would like to say that I think we have some new scholars that are doing wonderful things in terms of their work. There's a book on reparations by Charles Darity that just came out. It's here on my bookshelf, and I'm going to get you the full name of that book later on. But I think the pressing issues for me are the way that our criminal justice system is interfering with people and creating what we call the new Jim Crow. And as Michelle Alexander wrote in her groundbreaking 2010 book. So for me, I think if you're looking at questions of police violence, and I look at policing and mass incarceration and mass imprisonment as part of the same continuum. When I think about the question of police violence, there's a book called The End of Policing by Alex Vitale, Vitale. That is a wonderful book that would give you an understanding of the role that police play in our society today. Many people think police are the ones who provide us with public safety, but I think that's an incorrect understanding of what police do on a day-to-day basis. Over 95% of the time police spend in their careers is spent responding to non-violent activities. Most police will go many years without being involved in stopping a violent crime. So I just wanted to make this point. When protesters talk about defunding the police, they're talking about how we can be made safer if we have a broader idea of public safety. So we live in a society, and again, Arizona is a great case in point, where in many cases we don't have enough ventilators for everybody, but police have enough money for tanks and tear gas. So if you thought of public safety in a more broad way, we would be safer with more ventilators for people who are at threat from COVID and less tanks. So if you were to defund the police and fund healthcare, you're making us safer as a society. So Alex Vitale's book helps to make that point, and that book is called The End of Policing. Of course, we have the new Jim Crow from Michelle Alexander to talk about mass incarceration. And I'm going to get you the name of this book by Charles Darity, which only came out a month ago, which I think provides a very current analysis of the issue of reparations.
So our next question talks about families and schools. How can families and schools work together in a more inclusive way to build engaging communities, resulting in strong and healthy children?
That's a great question. I believe passionately that the way to create better schools in our country, and I'm thinking about public schools in particular, Ms. Crothers, the way to create better public schools is also going to be, when we think about investment in schools that are falling apart throughout our country, is going to be, once again, reparations. We have found that in the 60 years since Brown versus Board of Education has been decided, our schools, and there are reports that can show you this, our schools are just as segregated by race. Our public schools, K through 12, are just as segregated by race as they were before Brown versus Board of Education. And that, as was described in Brown by Justice Marshall and all of those NDoubleACP attorneys, if we cannot desegregate our schools, if our children cannot learn next to each other as children, how are they going to learn to appreciate each other and relate to each other as adults? How can we desegregate our society if we are not able to desegregate our schools? To answer your question about building healthy and strong communities, you can't do that without healthy and strong schools, and it's hard to have healthy and strong schools when schools are segregated, number one, or number two, there's such a wide disparity in terms of quality of education on the public school level. We had Supreme Court cases that have allowed this to happen, that allow, for example, the school funding mechanism to operate based on local school districts as opposed to mandating equal funding for every child in a particular state or in our country. Each locality is able to create its own school financing system, which results in wide disparities between school systems and per pupil expenditure. So as a result of that, we have a school system that is segregated not just on the grounds of race, but just as significantly on the grounds of access to resources. And until we solve that, we're not going to have healthy communities because people are not growing up in similar environments. There's going to be resentment. There's going to be continual lag in performance from people who do not have the same access to resources. So I think your question is so fundamental, and I don't think we solve that question until we make resources equal for our children who do not deserve unequal access to resources. A 5-year-old or a 10-year-old does not deserve to have 5 times as much money in their particular per pupil expenditure based on anything that they've done as individuals at that time. And I think we know that as a society. So the moral fabric of our society depends on the ability to reach the goal that you laid out for us. And I think that it's imperative that we get serious about solving that problem of school desegregation.
So the next question is asking your perspective around the protests. And it states, unfortunately, all of the looting and burning has overshadowed for many people that they talk to the main focus of the protest for equality and justice. How does anyone, this person wants to know, how do I counteract these criticisms?
That's a great question. And Ms. Worth, thank you for asking that question. I'll be completely honest with you. I have a great deal of skepticism for anyone who is more concerned about the damage done to a building or an inanimate object than the damage done to human beings and their bodies. If you can watch that video of the killing of George Floyd and then be dissuaded from the cause because you see some buildings burning, I question your values. I question your values. So I think that when you're dealing with inanimate objects, and this is a great question. I recently published an article in the Nation magazine on this question. If you can look at the damage done to inanimate objects and allow that to be a non-starter for you when it comes to supporting a protest, then what would you say about the Tea Party? Our country was founded on political protests, or not founded on the Tea Party, but founded with partly through the influence of a political protest, the Boston Tea Party, which was the damaging of property to protest unjust law. People understood at that time that harm done to inanimate objects in no way compares to harm done to human beings. And here we are faced with that same ethical choice today. And we need to be clear about that. You know, people call the damage done to inanimate objects violence, and they say that these are violent protests. And I think we have to and this is one way to engage your friends or associates who have this problem. I would challenge the fact that damage done to inanimate objects is always a violent activity. You know, if I ripped a piece of paper, I've damaged an inanimate object. That's not a violent thing to do. You know, if I chop a tree, that's not a violent thing to do. You can't use the same word necessarily and in a knee-jerk way for the harming of an inanimate object as you would for the harming of a human being. I think DeRay McKesson said this a few years ago. You can't equate broken windows with broken spines. And to do so just shows a paucity of values in terms of lack of understanding of the importance and sanctity of human life. And I think that if people think harder about these questions, I think they perhaps will come to a different conclusion.
Thank you. So the next one talks about the policies. Are there policies at the local level that the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center promotes that citizens advocate for in terms of training law enforcement relative to seeing color and de-escalation?
Great question. Currently, so these types of questions around reforms are things that I personally have advocated for in the past, and I think that the Thurgood Marshall Center has advocated in the past for de-escalation processes to be implemented. I can say, for example, based on my interactions with the United Nations, at the UN, there is a standard established for how police should interact with citizens around the world in a way that would acknowledge those citizens have human rights that should be recognized. One of the things should be that police officers should be given as a baseline standard the mandate to always explore non-lethal ways of subduing someone before and explore all non-lethal ways of subduing someone before resorting to lethal force, and to do so only when their life is in danger. And there have been efforts, and Amnesty International came and spoke to us one time about an effort that they were involved in to try to get that United Nations human rights standard adopted around the country by local police departments. But I'll be honest with you, there's been a move away from some of these reforms towards a more aggressive abolitionist framework for responding to these crises. I want to do a quick screen share to show you a chart that was shared with me from a group called Critical Resistance. I hope it's coming up for you, but there's a continuum between reformist steps in policing and abolitionist steps in policing. And I can provide this for people later on if they would want to access it themselves. There's a website for this. But things like body cameras, community policing, more training, these are interventions that people have found to not work, to be honest, over the course of the past 6 years since Ferguson. Instead, people are now desiring more abolitionist responses that allow us to acknowledge that there are better ways to create safety in our community than what we're doing now by overfunding the police. Again, as I said earlier, only like 4 or 5% of the time do police get involved in stopping violent crime or engaging in violent crime. We can find better ways to keep our communities safe. And those are the ways that we're exploring now through the Thurgood Marshall Center.
Can we prevent losing the hard fought momentum of this cause and avoid an outcome similar to gun control?
Yes, the best way we can avoid losing the momentum for this cause is to ensure that we continue to protest in the streets. And there's nothing else I don't think that works in the same way. I'll be honest about that. We've seen gun control, as you mentioned, gun control is a case in point. It's an issue that strikes to the heart of our feelings of safety as human beings. Overwhelming public sentiment that we need more gun control. Overwhelmingly, the political system has failed us when it comes to obtaining that gun control. And, I think people from all political backgrounds would agree that we have had a failure on that front in one way or another. Nobody seems happy about what we're doing with gun control. And the issue is not even on the table right now. But policing is, because people were in the streets. And so the way our democracy works, unfortunately, is a way that is it's not proactive on these issues, unfortunately, in our political environment. It's very difficult to get anything done. It's only when their feet are to the fire that things happen. And right now their feet are to the fire, and it's got to stay that way. And so I will say this, I do anticipate more protests over the course of the summer. If you think about the summer of '68 or even 2014, protests don't only last for a couple of weeks and then die out. They continue over the course of the summer. So there will be more protests, and I think that will help us to keep our momentum strong.
So we will try to get at least 2 more questions in before the end of the hour. And you spoke about the statues earlier, but this question is asking, have you worked on the removal or replacement of those in the past, and what has worked and what has not?
I think that the issue around Confederate statues, again, I want to say this. I think this is related to what's happening with policing. The project, when people call themselves even abolitionists, it's not only a project of dismantling, but it's also a project of building. People who want to defund the police only want to do so when there are replacement measures in place. maybe we don't want police to respond with a gun to people who have mental health crises, but that means we want someone who has training in mental health, a mental health worker, a social service worker, to respond in their place. Same thing with statues. I've worked to try to create memorials to people of color, to the renaming of buildings in honor of people who speak more to our multicultural legacy. And I'm very proud of that work to try to replace some of these memorials to Confederates who lost the Civil War, to memorials of people who might be inspiring to a more diverse community that we live in today. So I think that again, I think we should also look to that as a replacement project, not simply a removal project, a building project, not simply a taking down project. And so I'm happy to say that we have been involved in that work, specifically trying to get the building of a memorial to Charles Hamilton Houston, the teacher of Thurgood Marshall at Howard Law School. We've worked to try to get that memorial built in Washington, D.C. And, we're also trying to rename my own middle school, junior high school, which was named after E. Brooke Lee, who was also someone who had a history with the Confederates, from my understanding, and trying to rename that school in Silver Spring, Maryland, where I grew up.
So, Professor Hansford, this will be the last question, and we'll provide you with the additional questions that we've received if you want to look at them and help us with the response. But the last question, understanding the Black community is not a monolith, can you point out some prominent thought leaders to follow?
Certainly. Well, I think you probably know the ones throughout history, the James Baldwins, Malcolm X's, and W.B. Du Bois's of the world. But there's some prominent ones that are more current right now that I learned from. Robin D.G. Kelley is one prominent professor at UCLA who I follow, Robin Kelley. Another one, of course, Ta-Nehisi Coates is another one. I believe Mark Lamont Hill is a young man who's a brilliant thought leader when it comes to issues of race and justice. I believe Ruth Wilson Gilmore is a leader when it comes to the questions of abolitionist writings and scholarship, along with Angela Davis, and so many others I could name. Again, I'm looking at my bookshelf. There's so many people who are contributing to the conversation at this moment, but I think those are a few who might put you on the right course to find out more. There are many scholars that are entering this field, and people who are not even scholars but who are just commentators, who I think are providing wonderful grounding in what we need to do to move forward and create equality under the law and equal justice for all in American society.
Well, Professor Hansford, thank you very much. I would like to make an announcement before we sign off here. We'd like for our audience and others to join us on July 29th for the next event in our Sandra Day O'Connor Institute Constitution Series, Equality and Justice for All, when our guest speaker will be Dr. Spencer Crew, the author, historian, and director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian. For more information, visit o'connorinstitute.org. And Professor, again, we'd like to thank you for your comments today, for addressing these questions, and for sharing the materials that can enlighten some of us who had questions. And we'll be providing the additional questions to you. We'd like to thank all of you for being with us and hope you have a great day. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.